August 6, 1944, Normandy. The sky was white-hot, the kind of heat that made the air itself seem heavy. Dust lifted off the road in long shimmering waves, and the sound of tank engines rolled across the countryside like thunder trapped in metal. Inside those Shermans, it wasn't war, it was a furnace. The heat didn't just sting, it burned. Steel plates soaked the sun until they radiated like stove coils. Sweat dripped from helmets, pooling at men's boots. The air stank of oil, gunpowder, and boiled paint. Every breath tasted like smoke. The company had been pushing since dawn. No shade, no breaks. The order was simple. Push through 30 miles of French farmland before sundown and link up with the 4th Armored near Saint-Benoît. On paper easy, in reality, a death march for machines. Sherman tanks weren't built for this. Their Continental R975 engines were born for aircraft, made for cool, high-altitude air, not the choking heat of a battlefield in August. When you shut them down, they boiled. When you kept them running, they cooked themselves alive, and now, under the unbroken sun, they were cooking fast. Private Sims, the loader, sat slumped in the back of one tank, his face gray. "Feels like the devil's got his hand on my neck," he muttered. No one laughed. Nobody had the energy. Outside, the air shimmered over the armor like a mirage. From a distance, the convoy looked like ghosts rolling through a golden field, each Sherman leaving behind a trail of smoke, steam, and dust. By 0900, the first engine failed. A column of white smoke rose from Tank 11, then a pop, then silence. Its crew bailed out coughing, one of them ripping his shirt off and pressing it to the burning metal. "Overheat," the radio crackled. "Request tow," then another. And another command tried to keep the line moving, but you can't fight physics, or the sun. One by one, Sherman started dying. Temp gauges climbed past 230. Pistons warped. Oil foamed. Fans screamed until they seized. But one tank, Tank 23, kept moving. While others hissed and choked, it rumbled forward, engine steady, exhaust clean. The crew inside was drenched in sweat, their uniforms dark and sticking to their skin. But the gauges held steady, 190, no smoke. No burn. The lieutenant inside couldn't believe it. "How the hell are we not melting?" he asked. From the gunner's seat, a quiet voice answered. "Because she can breathe, sir." That was Sergeant Jack Morrison, known to most as Icebox Jack. Nobody in Bravo Company thought much of him. He wasn't loud, wasn't brave in the Hollywood sense. He was the guy who spent his nights with a wrench in one hand and a cigarette in the other, muttering to himself under the engine deck while everyone else played cards. They called him Professor Piston, Grease Monkey, and worse. But Jack didn't care about names. He cared about how things worked, especially when they didn't. And right now, while every other tank was suffocating, his was alive. The heat rose higher as the day stretched on. The road shimmered. Men coughed on dust and diesel fumes. Somewhere behind them, a machine gun rattled, Germans harassing from the hedgerows. The commander barked orders to keep moving no matter what. Jack's tank rolled past the wrecks of its own brothers, burnt out. Shermans with melted tracks and blackened engines. The smell of cooked oil filled the air. He glanced at the gauge again. 90, still holding. He smiled to himself, faintly. They had laughed at him for building that stupid contraption out of spare tubing and scrap from a wrecked aircraft radiator. They said it looked like a plumber's nightmare. But right now, that nightmare was the only reason they were still in this fight. By the time the sun reached its highest point, Bravo Company was down to half strength, engines silent. Guns unmanned, men sheltering under what little shade they could find. But Tank 23 kept going, its shadow crawling slowly across the road, its heartbeat steady, unbothered by the heat that melted steel. And in that endless glare, with nothing but sweat, dust, and the hum of a still-living machine, one truth began to take shape. This war wasn't just fought by heroes with rifles. Sometimes, it was won by men who refused to let their engines die. Before the war, Sergeant Jack Morrison was nobody special. At least, that's what he'd tell you. He was a small-town mechanic from Dayton, Ohio. A man who knew the sound of an engine better than the sound of applause. Jack's world was grease and grit, cracked knuckles, old overalls, a cigarette that always hung from his mouth, and a radio that never left the shop's window. He fixed tractors for farmers who couldn't afford new ones, patched up delivery trucks, and built things that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. He didn't read blueprints. He felt them. He'd say things like, "Machines talk if you listen close enough," and people would laugh, until their machines broke, and Jack's hands brought them back to life. When the draft came, Jack didn't complain. He just folded up his work rags, wiped the grease from his hands, and said to his boss, "Guess Uncle Sam's got a few engines that need fixing." He was 31 when he landed in France, older than most, quieter than all. The younger guys in Bravo Company saw him as the dad of the bunch, though they teased him for being too slow, too careful. They were loud, confident, ready to burn fuel and glory in equal measure. Jack was methodical. He took things apart that weren't broken just to see why they worked. When he first saw a Sherman tank up close, his eyes didn't go to the gun. They went to the vents, to the fan blades, to the radiator, mounts that looked undersized for the monster engine they were meant to. Cool. He ran a hand over the metal and frowned. "Beautiful," he murmured, "but she's gonna cook herself." The other crewman laughed. "Cook herself? It's a tank, Grandpa, not a turkey." But Jack didn't argue. He just smiled the way men do when they know time will prove them right. During training, while others were learning how to shoot, Jack spent nights studying the maintenance manuals, the parts everyone ignored. He marked notes in the margins, circled weaknesses in the design, oil flow inconsistencies, vent placement errors, overheating risks under load. One night, his lieutenant caught him elbow deep in an engine with the cover off, a flashlight between his teeth. "What the hell are you doing, Morrison? This isn't a science fair." Jack spat out the light and said, "If we're gonna ride inside this thing, sir, I'd like to know how she dies." The lieutenant shook his head. "You fix what breaks." "That's all." Jack nodded politely, but he didn't stop tinkering. When the platoon shipped out to France, the jokes got louder. They started calling his tank Jack's lemonade stand because of the jerry cans and spare tubing he always carried on the back. Once, a new recruit climbed up and asked, "What's all this junk supposed to do?" Jack replied, "Keep us breathing when everything else starts choking." They laughed. Of course, they always laughed. But Jack had grown up in summers where the Ohio sun baked tractors, till their engines seized mid-harvest. He'd learned to reroute cooling lines using soda cans, to keep radiators alive with water from cattle troughs, to improvise or lose the crop. To him, heat wasn't an inconvenience. It was an enemy, one he'd been fighting his whole life. So when he climbed into that Sherman, he wasn't just a gunner. He was a man who knew how to keep metal alive. And when the war's brutal rhythm began, the long marches, the relentless heat, the engine failures, Jack wasn't surprised. He'd already seen it coming. Every time another tank stalled, another engine died. The men would curse and kick the dirt. But Jack would glance at his gauges, all steady, and quietly mutter, "Told you she could breathe." The others thought he was lucky, but luck has a sound, and Jack had built it himself. He wasn't a hero. Not yet. But in a few days, when France's sun turned the battlefield into a furnace and every Sherman melted into silence, Jack Morrison would become something more than a mechanic. He'd become a legend that kept moving when everything else stopped. The Sherman was a masterpiece on paper, fast, mobile, easy to repair, but to the men who lived inside it, the tank was a furnace with treads. Jack knew it from the first time he fired her up. The roar of the radial engine wasn't a clean hum like an airplane. It was a trapped, choking growl. Every vibration said the same thing: too much heat, not enough air. He'd seen the signs during training. Engines that hissed when you shut them down, oil boiling in the lines, mechanics trying to patch leaks faster than they appeared. But in France, those problems became fatal. The summer of '44 was merciless. Every march kicked up dust so thick it coated the radiators. The tanks were sealed tight for protection, which meant no airflow. The fans strained. The gauges climbed. And when those numbers hit red, The Sherman's heart stopped. No air. No movement. No escape. Jack called it suffocation. The officers called it acceptable loss. But for the crews trapped inside, it felt like being buried alive. He watched men bail out of dead tanks, gasping, eyes wild, uniforms smoking from the heat radiating off the steel. One of them collapsed right beside his treads. His hands blistered from touching the armor. Jack jumped down to help, and the man croaked. She just stopped. Jack looked at the dead tank, steam rising from its vents. She didn't stop, he said quietly. She choked. Later that night, while the rest of the company rested, Jack sat on the engine deck of Tank 23, staring at the stars. He could hear the soft ticking of the metal cooling. The Sherman was still hot, still alive, barely. He took a sip from his canteen, then muttered to himself, "If you can make her breathe, she'll never die." That was when the idea started forming, the stupid idea everyone mocked. He began sketching lines in the dirt, marking airflow paths, pressure drops, water loops. It wasn't fancy engineering, it was farm logic. Heat out, air in, keep the heart moving. The next morning, he raided the junk pile, scavenged aluminum tubing, a cracked radiator, an old aircraft pump. The others laughed when he started bolting it together. One shouted, "You building a bathtub, Morrison?" Jack didn't answer. He was too busy giving the tank her lungs. It started as a joke. At least, that's what everyone thought when they saw what Jack was building behind Tank 23. The other crews had spent the morning cleaning their guns, writing letters home, or trying to find shade under trees. But Jack was knee-deep in scrap metal, tubing, and grease, his sleeves rolled up, face blackened, a cigarette glued to his lip. He'd torn apart an old aircraft radiator, stripped hoses from a wrecked Jeep, and was now welding everything into a strange maze that clung to the Sherman's rear like a mechanical spider. Lieutenant Hawkins came by and frowned. "What in God's name is that?" Jack didn't look up. "Cooling rig," Hawkins snorted. "Cooling rig? Morrison, this isn't a tractor. That engine's designed by aircraft engineers." "Yeah," Jack said, tightening a bolt. "For the sky, not for hell." By afternoon, the others had gathered to watch. Corporal Lewis cracked, "You sure you're not making a still back there, Icebox?" Jack just grinned. Wouldn't waste good copper on booze. They laughed, hard. One of them drew a cartoon on the mess hall board that night. A tank with pipes sticking out like spaghetti. Labeled Jack's Lemonade Stand. But Jack kept going. He scavenged an old aircraft water pump from a depot and wired it to the Sherman's auxiliary system. He rigged a loop that ran water through the engine block, out into a cooling canister filled with air vents, and back again. Primitive. Ugly. But it worked, at least in theory. When he tested it the first time, steam hissed out of the pipes. The crew ducked for cover. "Relax," Jack said calmly. "That's her breathing." For the next few days, he fine-tuned the contraption, tightened valves, added a pressure release, rebalanced the flow. The other tanks sat baking in the field, their crews cursing the heat. But inside Tank 23, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. Hawkins eventually climbed aboard, ran a hand over the web of tubing and muttered, "You're insane." Jack wiped his hands on a rag. Maybe, but she's not choking anymore. No one believed. It would matter. No one thought. It would hold under fire. But when the next push began under the hottest sun of the summer, every man who'd laughed at him was praying Jack's plumbing nightmare would somehow work, and before the day was done, they'd all find out. August 6th, 1944. The dawn broke red and angry over the hedgerows. Bravo Company was on the move before breakfast. 30 miles of open country to cross, and reports of German armor ahead. Engines coughed awake, one after another. The sound should have been comforting, an orchestra of steel and power, but to Jack Morrison, it sounded like 100 ticking time bombs. The air was already hot. Too hot. By the time the sun crested the tree line, the temperature inside each Sherman climbed past 120 degrees. Hawkins' voice crackled over the radio. "Keep formation. No stops until we hit Saint Benoit. Move out." The tanks lurched forward, treads biting into the dirt. Jack sat at his post, one hand on the gun's breech, the other hovering near the temperature gauge. 60, 70, 180, still good. He reached down and flipped a small switch near his leg. The pump under the floor began to hum, a low, steady vibration. Behind him, Private Sims squinted at the maze of pipes running along the walls. "You sure that thing's not gonna blow, Jack?" "Won't blow," he said, eyes on the gauge. "She'll breathe." At first, everything held steady. But by 1,000 hours, the radio started filling with panic. "This is Tank 11. We're overheating." "Shutting down!" "Tank 8 to command. Oil pressure critical. We're losing her!" Within 2 hours, half the line had gone still. The road ahead shimmered with rising heat. The smell of burnt oil filled the air. Hawkins shouted over the din, "Keep moving! If we stop, we die." Jack glanced at his gauge again. Bundy, he could feel the heat pressing in, suffocating. The air inside the tank was thick enough to choke on. Sweat ran into his eyes. But the gauge didn't climb. Then the world exploded. The first shell hit 50 yards ahead, German 88s hidden behind a hedgerow. One Sherman went up in flames instantly. Another lurched sideways, its treads blown clean off. The air filled with black smoke and screaming metal. "Ambush! Ambush!" the radio crackled. Hawkins barked, "Reverse! Reverse!" But the tanks behind them were already dead. Engines seized. Crew scrambling for cover. The company was trapped. Jack's heart slammed against his ribs. "Sir," he said, "if we stay here, we're cooked." Hawkins gritted his teeth. "And if we move forward?" Jack looked at the glowing gauge, steady at 190. "Then we fight." Without waiting for permission, Jack slammed his hand on the driver's shoulder. "Forward."
"Full throttle!"
the Sherman roared. The pipes hissed. The cooling pump screamed like a living thing. They broke through the wall of smoke, charging straight toward the ridge where the flashes came from. Shells ripped the earth around them. One tore through a barn on their left. Another grazed their turret, leaving a molten scar. Inside, the temperature soared. But still, the gauge held steady. Jack loaded a shell, slammed the breech, and yelled, "On target, range 400. Hawkins aimed, fired. The round punched through the German gun nest. Silence for a heartbeat, then a bloom of orange fire. "Target down." Sims shouted, but there were more. Another gun crew swung their barrel toward them. Jack didn't flinch. "Keep her breathing," he barked, twisting the valve to full. The water loop howled. Steam vented from the pipes, white and angry. To the men outside, it looked like Tank 23 was on fire, but inside, she was alive. Hours passed in chaos, heat, dust, shouting, and endless motion. When the last 88 went quiet, Bravo Company was scattered. Half their tanks dead. Only one had never stopped. Tank 23, 18 hours. No rest, no stall. No mercy. As night fell, Jack leaned back against the hull, drenched in sweat, trembling. The gauge read 185. Still perfect. He gave the metal a tired pat and whispered, "Told you, girl. Just needed to breathe." The battlefield was chaos. Not the kind that comes in flashes, but the kind that grinds on for hours until your ears stop registering the explosions. Dust and smoke clung to the ground like fog, broken only by the silhouettes of burning tanks. Everywhere Jack looked, metal was dying. Bravo Company's formation had scattered into fragments. The convoy that left at sunrise as a proud armored column was now a graveyard of stalled machines. Engines still glowed from the heat. You could see them through cracked vents, pulsing red like molten hearts. But one heart kept beating. Tank 23, bruised and blackened, pushed forward through the haze. Her armor bore scratches from shrapnel, a dent where an 88 mm shell had ricocheted, and streaks of mud and soot across her flanks. Yet she kept going. Inside, the noise was unbearable. Every rattle, every groan from the treads felt like a scream. Jack could barely hear Hawkins' voice over the intercom. "What's our status?" "Cooling steady," Jack shouted back. "Oil pressure's fine. She's still breathing. Then keep her moving." They were supposed to retreat. That was the plan. But Tank 23 wasn't listening. As long as her engine hummed, Jack refused to stop. They broke through a line of shattered trees and rolled straight into another ambush, a cluster of German infantry armed with Panzerfausts. The gunner, Private Sims, swung the turret. Targets! Left side! Jack slammed another shell into the breach. Fire! The cannon roared. The recoil slammed through the hull, shaking the floor plates. The round exploded among the hedgerows, sending soldiers scattering like shadows. One rocket hit their side armor. The tank jolted but held. Smoke hissed from the vents, but the engine didn't stall. Jack! Sims yelled.
We're hit!
Jack checked the gauges. Still in the green. Not dead yet, he said.
Load another.
The next shot cleared the ridge. The German line broke. By dusk, the company had regrouped behind what was left of a farmhouse. One by one, the surviving tanks limped in. Engines wheezing, radiators leaking, exhausts belching smoke. But when Tank 23 rolled up, her engine was smooth, her idle steady, like she hadn't just fought for 18 hours straight. The silence that followed was heavy. Men climbed out of their tanks, their faces streaked with oil and soot, and just stared. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what they'd seen. A tank that refused to die. Lieutenant Hawkins stepped down from the turret, legs trembling, and walked over to Jack, who was wiping his hands on a rag still dripping with coolant. "You built this contraption?" he asked, nodding at the maze of pipes, some cracked and leaking steam. Jack nodded once. "Looks like hell," Hawkins said. Jack gave a faint smile. "Yeah, but it runs." For the first time, Hawkins didn't have a comeback. He just stood there, looking at the tank, then at the field of silent Shermans around them. "Every other one gave up," he murmured. "Yours didn't." Jack looked at the machine, its hull still radiating warmth in the night. "She just needed air." "Sir." Later, when command came through the radio asking for operational status, Hawkins keyed the mic and answered, "Tank 23, still running." Those words spread fast across the company. Still running. In a war where machines failed as fast as men. That phrase meant something. It meant life. It meant hope. And before long, soldiers began whispering it like a prayer. Tank 23, the tank that wouldn't die. The battlefield quieted as the sun sank low, painting the horizon orange and blood red. Smoke still curled from overturned Shermans and burned out hedgerows. But for the first time that day, there was space to breathe. Bravo Company gathered slowly, their movements heavy with exhaustion. Faces streaked with soot and sweat, hands blistered from heat, eyes hollow from witnessing engines die under fire. Every man knew what had kept them alive. Jack climbed down from Tank 23, boots sinking into the soft dirt. His uniform was soaked, blackened with grease and dust, but his eyes were steady. Around him, men muttered quietly to one another, some shaking their heads in disbelief. "Did you see her?" someone whispered. "Still running." "After everything." "Yeah," another said. That thing saved us." The laughter and mockery of the past days had vanished. No one called it the lemonade stand anymore. No one joked about Icebox Jack. The tank was no longer a curiosity. It was a lifeline. Lieutenant Hawkins approached, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at Jack, really looked at him, for the first time not as a tinkering mechanic, but as a man who had saved lives. "I owe you an apology, Morrison," he said quietly. Jack didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, surveying the crew scattered around him. Men were quietly inspecting the tubing, noting how the pump worked, asking questions they'd never dared to before. "They didn't have to," Hawkins continued. "All the others stalled. Yours didn't. You kept us moving." Jack finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "It wasn't about being right," he said. "It was about not dying." The crew absorbed that in silence. Respect had replaced ridicule. It wasn't flashy and it wasn't loud, but it was real. No medals. No speeches. No headlines. Just men who had lived another day because one man refused to accept that the system as it was would survive. As night fell, the men gathered in a loose circle around a fire made from scraps of ammo crates. Coffee passed hands. Tired voices recounted the day in broken sentences, but everyone's eyes kept drifting to the tank. The pipes glinted faintly in the firelight, steam rising from small vents. Some of the younger soldiers approached Jack cautiously, measuring the tubing, asking about the pump, scribbling notes. Mechanics and engineers alike studied the setup, trying to learn what they could, and Jack answered them quietly, without pride or boast. That night, the laughter was gone. In its place was reverence, not for a man, not for a tank, but for ingenuity, stubbornness, and the simple, brutal truth that survival often came from the hands of someone who refused to give up. Tank 23 hummed quietly, like a heartbeat, a symbol of resilience amid the chaos. And in that silence, Bravo Company understood something essential. Sometimes respect comes quietly, after the smoke clears, when the world witnesses what refuses to die. The war moved on. Europe was a vast, living battlefield, and by the time the push through France turned into campaigns in Luxembourg and Belgium, Tank 23 and its crew had become a quiet legend. Jack Morrison never sought the spotlight. No medal ceremonies, no interviews, no stories in newspapers. He wasn't the kind of man to brag. But everywhere the company went, his work followed, silently. Other crews began modifying their Shermans with bits of tubing, pumps scavenged from jeeps, and recycled water tanks. Some rigs were crude, some elegant, but all carried the same DNA, the principle Jack had proven in the fiery fields of Normandy. Innovation born from frustration, sweat, and necessity. When new soldiers arrived, they were shown Tank 23 first. The men of Bravo Company didn't need to explain much. The engine hummed steadily, gauges calm, the pipes running like veins along her hull. The tacit lesson was clear. Ingenuity mattered. Adaptation saved lives. One clever mind, willing to defy convention, could tip the scales between death and survival. Jack's own crew never needed another setup. The original held 3 more campaigns, endless miles of mud, dust, and shellfire, and the tank never faltered. Each night, they cleaned, adjusted, and checked her, treating her like the living machine she was. Respect had replaced mockery. Fear had replaced doubt. Back home in Ohio, Jack returned to his quiet life repairing trucks and crop dusters. He married, raised kids, and never mentioned the war unless pressed. Newspapers never printed his story. History books never listed him, but the men who had ridden in Tank 23 never forgot. They remembered who kept them moving when everything else failed. They remembered the quiet man who worked in grease-stained coveralls, laughed at, called insane, yet saved their lives with duct tape, tubing, and stubborn brilliance. In mess halls and barracks long after the war, older soldiers would tell the story of the stupid cooling system. Not with exaggeration, not with glamour, but with respect. It was a story about survival, about the quiet difference one person could make, and the unexpected ways courage could manifest. Jack Morrison didn't save the war. But for 18 hours in the heat, dust, and fire of northern France, he kept it moving. His tank, ugly and improvised, became a lifeline, and sometimes that mattered more than medals or promotions. That's the real machinery of war. Not just tanks, planes, or artillery, but minds willing to see beyond what's written in the manual. To repair, to tinker, to imagine solutions when failure seems inevitable. The moral of Jack's story is simple. What seems foolish today might save lives tomorrow. The thing everyone laughs at in the barracks could be the only thing standing between chaos and survival. And sometimes, the quietest hero is the one who never stops moving when everything else has failed. Tank 23 hummed in silence that night, under the cool stars, a testament to ingenuity and perseverance. Jack Morrison never sought recognition, but the men who survived because of him knew. And sometimes that was enough.